Joining us now is Leon Panetta, who served as both Secretary of Defense and Director of the CIA in the Obama administration, and is now Chairman of the Panetta Institute for Public Policy. Welcome, Mr. Secretary. What do you make of Donald Trump?
John, I think, like a lot of people, I'm still trying to figure him out and try to figure out just exactly who we're going to have as the new president. He's very unconventional. You're just not quite sure which Donald Trump is going to walk into the Oval Office, whether it's the reality TV tweeting president, or whether it's the business president who will be serious-minded about approaching it. So it's really difficult right now to try to get a sense of just exactly what the president-elect is going to be like.
And what do you make of some of the picks that he's made for top positions? Do they give you any sense of what his administration might look like?
Well, in many ways, it reflects some of the positions, obviously, he took during the campaign. But at the same time, obviously, he's talking to a lot of people. And I suspect he is probably for the first time getting a real sense of what the awesome responsibility of president is all about. And it just seems to me that in light of that, he's beginning to talk to a number of people that will bring some experience and some perspective that I think he's going to need if he's going to be able to deal with the multitude of crises he's going to be confronting.
One of the things I heard over and over again during the campaign is voters would say, he doesn't have Washington experience, but he'll be able to surround himself with advisors. When you hear that, having held as many different posts as you have had, having advised as many presidents as you have had, what's your response to that idea?
That's not good enough. The reality is, it is the President of the United States who has to make the final decision. And you can have a lot of bright people. They can present you a lot of options. But unless you've taken the time as president to understand those issues, to read into those issues, to understand the consequences of those issues, you cannot just rely on others to tell you what you should or shouldn't do. You've got to make the decision.
So far, Donald Trump has picked a lot of people who are already on his team. They call them loyalists inside the Trump campaign. What does that suggest to you in terms of this quality that people talk about with presidents, somebody needing to be able to go in there and tell them no? How important is that quality?
Well, there's no question that loyalty is important, but if you're going to be, a top staff assistant to the President of the United States, you've got to be willing to tell him the truth. You've got to be willing to tell him when you think he's wrong and when he's taking the wrong step. I mean, the biggest problem in the White House that I've experienced is that everybody's trying to figure out what the president wants to hear and then tell the president what he wants to hear. And I suspect that, a big personality like Donald Trump, probably intimidates a lot of people who don't necessarily want to look him in the eye and tell him exactly what he may not want to hear. But I always felt my responsibility as chief of staff was to be the person who walked into the Oval Office and said to the president, you can't do that, or this is wrong, and be able to tell him what you believe is the truth. And if you don't have that, that I think starts a president off on the wrong foot.
Let me ask you to tap into your experience as Secretary of Defense. General James Mattis, Marine General, is being talked about, and as Secretary of Defense. Explain for people why the civilian control of the military is a tradition, and why having a general is a good or a bad thing, or just what kinds of things people should be thinking about.
Well, it goes back to George Washington. There's a great portrait up at the Capitol of George Washington giving up his commission in the military in order to become president of the United States, which I think was a reflection of the fact that it's important to have civilian leadership and civilian perspective when it comes to those issues. Doesn't mean that you can't have a military background. I think that that is important to have that background. But at the same time, in those jobs, you've got to exercise the ability to understand political issues, to deal with broader issues that involve your capability to relate to the American people. And so, yes, having a strong defense background is important, but it's also important to be able to have that ability to understand the civilian side of that job, because both are involved as Secretary of Defense.
You've worked with James Mattis. What do you think about him as a Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense? Excuse me.
I like Jim Mattis a lot. He's a tough general. Spoke the truth. Was a good advisor. I trusted his defense judgment, and so I think he's got a lot of qualities that are important to a Secretary of Defense job. I do think that it's important for Congress to talk with him if he is nominated, to make sure that he also understands this civilian perspective, because I think it's important to have that when you become Secretary.
Speaking of Congress and confirmations, the director of the CIA, what question should members of Congress ask the director about taking over the CIA now?
I think the most important question is to ask whether or not you are willing to provide the most accurate and credible intelligence to the President of the United States, whether he wants to hear it or not. The role of a CIA director is to provide that kind of credible intelligence. That's the whole purpose of providing the so-called presidential daily brief. It's to inform the president of what's taking place in the world. What do we know about the world? What do we know about crises? What do we know about those that are trying to in some way threaten this country? Frankly, one of the concerns I have right now is that this president is not getting his intelligence briefings. He's taken a few of them, but he's not getting them every day. If you're President of the United States, you better be in touch on a daily basis with your intelligence briefers, so that you have an understanding as to what's happening in the world, what are the crises you have to pay attention to, and what steps do you have to take in order to deal with those crises. So it is really important for a director of the CIA to make very clear that the president ought to receive the truth. And that is probably the most important responsibility when it comes to national security.
Explain for people why a president couldn't check in with his intelligence briefers every once in a while. It didn't need it every day.
It doesn't work that way. You are constantly on the intelligence scale looking at a series of threats that may be out there. Some of them may be credible, some may not be credible. But those threats change on a day-to-day basis with new intelligence, with new sources, with new assets that provide information. So it's constantly changing. You can't just take one briefing one day and then 3 days later go back and figure out what's going on. You've got to be able to do this on a daily basis. And that's what presidents do. Every president I know, and I've worked under 9 presidents, every one has taken their intelligence daily brief, because that sets the agenda for what you have to focus on as President of the United States.
What's your view about Donald Trump is thinking about bringing back the process of waterboarding as a part of, or enhanced interrogation techniques, whatever you want to call it? What's your opinion about that?
I just think it would be the wrong step to take at this point in time. We've set that aside. We think it violates our values. I think Jim Mattis is right that there are other ways to get the information that we need. It's been proven by the FBI. It's been proven by the military. I just don't think we need to get into that kind of debate about whether or not we ought to resurrect waterboarding as a tactic in interrogation. We don't need it.
The only job you haven't held, it seems, would be Secretary of State, but Donald Trump is looking at a Secretary of State. If you were giving him advice, given all that you know, the 9 presidents you served, people have been discussed, or General Petraeus, Mitt Romney, Rudy Giuliani. Assess that field in terms of what you know from your inside experience a Secretary of State has to do.
For this president in particular, but it's probably true for every president, no matter how experienced they may be, you want to have a Secretary of State that understands the world, understands the issues that are out there, has the ability to relate to other world leaders, has the ability to be able to implement diplomacy, to engage with others, but most importantly, has the ability to understand how do you, on a diplomatic basis, approach the crises that a president of the United States has to deal with. You need to have a strong Secretary of State because that person is your ambassador to the world. And without that, you are left without the information and without the ability to make the right decisions that have to be made in a complicated world. We're dealing with a world that's very dangerous right now. Got a lot of flashpoints in this world. You need to have a Secretary of State that understands those flashpoints and understands how to deal with our adversaries, but also how to deal with our allies.
Do you think one of those fits that criteria?
My sense is that I know he's talking to Mitt Romney. I think Romney would be able to fit that. I think there are others he's talking to that obviously would be able to accomplish that as well. But I think the president needs to understand that if he's going to implement a strong foreign policy, if he's going to take care of our national security, a strong Secretary of State is absolutely essential to your ability to protect this country and to advance our interests in the world.
But on the budget, what is the fiscal picture that Donald Trump faces with all the plans that he has? Put that in context for us in terms of the budget picture.
I remember a long time ago when I was chairman of the Budget Committee, sitting down with the newly elected President Bush, who had said, "Read my lips, no new taxes." And I remember telling him, "Mr. President, I know you made that pledge, but if you're going to be able to have the resources you need, I don't care what your priorities are. If you're going to be able to have the resources, you have got to deal with the growing deficit and the growing debt in this country." And ultimately, to his credit, the president did deal with that, as did President Clinton. And as a consequence, we produced a balanced budget and a surplus. This president is entering office with a huge national debt, $20 trillion. And it's on a path to go up, not to come down, but to go up. We're looking at $1 trillion deficits. We're looking at that national debt doubling in a period of 10 years. If this president does not sit down with the leadership of the Congress and develop a budget agreement that puts everything on the table, entitlements, taxes, discretionary spending, defense spending, puts everything on the table, and comes up with a budget deal to try to set some path of certainty for the future that reduces that debt, reduces the deficit, but more importantly then provides the resources he needs, then what's going to happen is this debt will undermine his ability to have a strong economy. It's that simple.
You know politics so well. Republicans now control the House and the Senate. They've got a Republican president. There are some deficit hawks on the Hill. How strong do you think they will be in having the kind of conversation you had with President Bush about the constraints, the budget constraints on an ambitious president who wants to do a lot?
I think it's extremely important for this president to understand. I mean, he identified the debt as a problem. Now, admittedly, a lot of the things he proposed would increase that debt. But he understands that that debt will slow growth, will increase interest rates, and will rob him of resources. I think the leadership on the Hill, Capitol Hill, has to make very clear that there are several things he has to do. Number one, he's got to make the American people aware of the consequences of not dealing with this debt, to create a political support system for him. He's got to, in his first budget, lay out goals that he wants to achieve that make clear that he is going to gradually reduce that deficit. And then thirdly, frankly, he's got to engage on a bipartisan basis with Democrats and Republicans and come up with a budget agreement. That would set a future for this country fiscally that I think would guarantee that our economy could be strong in the future.
Leon Panetta, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you.